So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you to the VIP coaches and mentorship coaches. Like I mentioned, we just wrapped up the VIP social and we'll go into the mentorship portion after Lori's presentation. But tonight we have Lori with us, who is a mental performance consultant at Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic, but she's also an assistant professor in the kinesiology department at Dalhousie University. And not only is she a mental performance consultant at Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic, but she also works with some national teams such as our gymnastics team, who will be representing us at the Olympics next year. So we're really excited to have Lori on here to talk to us about stress and anxiety and just in general the importance of like a coach's self-care and management of themselves, definitely during this time. And I know we just took a quick poll of like how coaches are feeling right now. And yes, there's a lot of excitement, but there's also overwhelmment and a bit of frustration. So this will definitely be hopefully it will be very helpful to a lot of you, and really looking forward to it. So thank you, Lori.
Thanks for having me, and I hope everybody's having a good week so far. So like Kirsty said, tonight I'm going to be discussing stress and anxiety, and I always find it interesting talking about this topic on a couple different notes. One, I also teach a class at Dal, a fourth year class that's basically on stress and how stress impacts us. And my students always say, you know, learning so much about stress stresses us out, because then we realize how much of an impact it can have on our body and mind. So I want to kind of just preface by saying this talk is meant to hopefully relieve stress and not cause stress. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Secondly, it's always, as I'm making this presentation, sometimes it's a good reflection on my own part to realize, you know, I'm going to be talking about stress and anxiety and the importance of management and self-care. And then I'm writing these things out and I'm thinking, wow, I should probably listen to my own advice more often than I probably do. So I'll say I can empathize and sympathize with all of you on this call if you're feeling overwhelmed and some frustration. So this is meant to be kind of, I'm going to present some information. I'll be asking questions. So I do want this to be kind of a discussion. If anybody has any questions at any time, Kirsty, I don't have kind of the people on my screen. So feel free to interrupt me at any point in time if anybody has any questions, and there'll be some time at the end for questions as well. So I will ask questions, and feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself and contribute verbally as well. What I do want to do, see here. So it's important to kind of first start off, and I always find it kind of sometimes silly, sometimes not, to just kind of remind ourselves of what we're going to be talking about. And it's important to really best understand these concepts and what they really mean and how they're different. And I think if we're going to talk about kind of the impact of stress and the importance of self-care, it's really important to understand what it actually is and what the purpose of stress is and why we might feel this way. First and foremost, if we don't understand the process, then it's difficult to actually kind of mitigate any of its negative impacts. So, you know, from a scientific point of view, stress is this imbalance between demands and resources. So physical or psychological demands placed on an individual, and your ability or your response capability under conditions which failure to meet these demands has important consequences. So it really is an imbalance between the demands and the resources that you perceive to have to meet these demands. Whenever, you know, I give the primary example I give in class to students or anybody, if you have a project or if you have a deadline for something and you don't feel you have enough time. So, you know, the demand is a project, your resource is time, and there's an imbalance or perceived imbalance between those two, and that can cause stress, okay? We talk about in psychology a stress process. So what are the implications of the stress process for practice, or how do we intervene? And this is what we talk about as the stress process up on the screen here. So how stress manifests itself. If we talk about this imbalance between a demand and resources, the first part or the first stage of stress is that presentation of the demand. So whether it's a physical demand, a psychological demand, it's the perception. So the environmental demand presents itself. You have this project due, or you're going for a hike and a coyote walks out onto the trail. Whatever there is a demand in front of you, that's stage one. Stage two is, again, this idea of this perception. So how much an individual will perceive that threat as an actual threat. And this is important because what I perceive as a threat might be very different than what another person perceives as a threat. One of the most, I think, tangible examples that I use in teaching is, public speaking. Most of people don't like public speaking. I do that for a living. So if you present to me an example of like, here in 5 minutes, you have to stand up in front of a crowd of 200 people, that's not a huge stress for me, depending on what I have to do. If you ask me to sing, well, then I'll be really stressed out. But if it's just kind of talk or introduce yourselves, that to me is not incredibly stressful. I understand, though, that for most people who don't make a living out of public speaking, that can be an incredibly huge stressor. So it's that perception of threat that's the next stage. So, and everybody's going to have a different perception of that. The next stage is, once we have that the perception of that stress, it's the stress response. And that can be physical, so changes in our physical body, and it can also be psychological, the thoughts that are going on in your head once you're presented with that threat. So public speaking, oh my God, what am I going to say? What am I going to do? People are going to judge me. People are going to look at me. I don't want people to look at me. That would be the psychological response to stress. The physical response to stress might be sweating, heart racing, breathing rate decreases, sweaty palms, cotton mouth, that feeling of heat just coming out from your chest up onto your face. I have a really close friend of mine who hates public speaking, and as soon as you say something about public speaking, her very light-skinned face just becomes completely red immediately. So she has a visible physiological response. Also can have muscle tension, attention changes. So there's more non-obvious types of physiological response as well. The next step is, or the next stage would be the behavioral consequences or the outcomes, the behavioral outcomes or performance. So what happens if we have to behave following that stress response? And that can in turn depend on how we perceive the threat. Sometimes it makes us perform better. Sometimes it makes us freeze and forget or stumble our words. It can lead to different outcomes. So it's important to understand kind of how this process works if we're going to understand stress and how to manage it. How stress impacts our whole body is also important to be aware of. So I want to go just briefly over more of the scientific or the nervous system part of the stress process, because I think it's important to understand how it can actually have a major or significant impact on our body, not just short-term, but long-term as well. So stress has a direct impact on our autonomic nervous system, which is mostly unconscious and responsible for regulating all of our bodily functions. So things like breathing, things like digestion, things like your heart rate, things like your breathing rate, the autonomic part, or another way to think about it, the automatic part of your nervous system, things that you don't have to think about that automatically happen in your body. So stress has an impact on that nervous system. That nervous system has two branches or two parts: the parasympathetic nervous system, and this is the most technical part of this, and then we're going to get into some discussion. But it is important to kind of think about these when we talk about stress. Your parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for when you are resting, when you're relaxing, and when you're rebuilding, whether it's your memories or your muscle regeneration or your recovery process. It's responsible for your digestion. It's responsible for your sleep state. It's also can be responsible for body changes. So basically, when you're in this state of rest, relaxation, and your parasympathetic nervous system is the one kind of guiding your body at that time, your body temperature can drop. So when you fall asleep, your body temperature tends to drop a little bit. Your breathing is deeper and slower. So think of how your breathing is when you're just chilling out on the couch, watching something on TV, relaxing. Your muscles are relaxed. You have more circulation in your body, in the core of your body, which helps with digestion and other parts of your body that you don't have to think about. Okay. So this is kind of the ideal state, is our parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is functions in terms of your fight or flight response. We go into sympathetic nervous system when we need to react to something that is stressful. So when there is a threat. Going from parasympathetic to sympathetic causes changes in our body so that we are better able to fight, run, or do anything to survive. This is kind of our survival mechanism. What that means is that we have a surge of adrenaline, so an increase in our blood sugars, which will allow us, you hear these anecdotes of, parents being able to lift the car to save their children or do these miraculous things. Surge of adrenaline would cause that. Your breathing rate becomes more shallow and fast. Your pupils dilate. You have increased blood flow to your extremities, ready to fight. You have increased temperature, increased muscle tension, and more sweating. All of this is to prepare yourself to fight or flight. I want you to think of an example of a cat. If anybody of you owns a cat or have a cat, you know that most of the day they're laying around trying to find some sun and they're pretty chill and relaxed. Threaten a cat and all of a sudden you see the hair go up, they arch up, and all that has a function to make them seem bigger. They start kind of growling or they'll hiss or whatnot. That is their fight or flight, that sympathetic nervous system in a cat, okay? So it serves a purpose. So if we think as human beings, how we like to be, or how we have evolved as a species, our body is designed to exist and function in a parasympathetic state, meaning we're meant to be in a relaxation recovery mode very much most of the time. Sympathetic nervous system function is really only designed for emergency situations, okay? So think, again, coming back to this cat analogy or example, picture, never mind just a cat, picture any animal, picture wild animals out in the Sahara Desert or in the wilderness. They are usually just chilling. They're not threatened. They're behaving like in the parasympathetic state most of the time. And then when they see a threat or feel a threat, they go into a sympathetic state, which then allows them to fight or flight. So I want you to think about this. If we are designed to exist in a parasympathetic state and only to be in a sympathetic state in emergency situations, what state do you tend to live your life in this moment? And I know for me, it is certainly not the majority of parasympathetic state. And I will, take a global pandemic out of the question here. I'm still probably wouldn't be majority of the time in a parasympathetic state, right? So if our bodies have evolved and are designed to exist in this parasympathetic state, however, we're existing in a mostly sympathetic state, that has some serious implications on our body's functioning, hormonal, chemical, all of those things. I will just note, if this this topic particularly interests you, there is a book that's had a couple editions out that's called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And it's all about why, exactly that. Why do animals who seem to have greater threat in terms of survival, for the most part, seem to be able to live in this parasympathetic state most of the time? So I just honestly, I like the title of that book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. It's pretty catchy, but it is all about how stress can impact our body's physical state. Okay, so I want you to keep thinking about this. What state do you tend to live in? When I made this slide, I giggled because I think it's, if this topic was requested, I'm guessing that most of you are stressed. I'm guessing most of us are stressed in a global pandemic, and where we have to adapt pretty much on the daily. But some signs and symptoms that you might be a little stressed. Fatigue, feeling lethargic, mild depression or anxiety or brain fog, poor memory, lightheaded when you're standing too quickly. Now, these can be not necessarily symptoms of stress, or other things, but these, it can be included. Salt cravings, sometimes sugar, depending on time of day. You get sick more easily, you're more irritable. You have decreased ability to handle stressful situations, decreased patience and tolerance, decreased productivity. Does this sound familiar to anybody? I'm actually curious, this is kind of an abbreviated list, but does anybody have any other indicators? Because I think it's important to understand that each of us manifests stress differently, and I'm happy to share how I do once we get through these examples. But I think it's also important or helpful to share or communicate what your indicators of stress are, particularly in a mentorship context as well. So talking about it is important. It's also important to know that you're not alone. So I'm curious to know if anybody would like to share what are other symptoms of stress that you might be experiencing. Yeah, so I'm just opening the chat here. Weight gain from eating, so stress eating, very common. Difficulty focusing. Appetite, you can either have increased appetite, cravings for particular types of food, or a decrease of appetite. Problem sleeping, yeah. And feel free to add in the chat or unmute yourselves.
If I can quickly interject here,
Sure.
Something that I find interesting as an equestrian coach is the book that you mentioned, which I'll certainly look up. It sounds fascinating. Why zebras don't get ulcers?
Yeah.
And as we were going down through this, I'm thinking about the two athletes that we work with, the equine and the human athlete.
Yes.
And one of the biggest factors we're dealing with in our competition horses today is ulcers.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
That's funny because I was just thinking the same thing. I was thinking, you know what? I bet zebras actually do get ulcers.
Maybe now. Maybe, I mean, this book originally was written in the 90s, so maybe things have changed.
But it's diet related, but it's also, we put a lot of pressure on our equine athletes. So I have to, that's so interesting because we're combining the two athletes in our sport.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. And I think those poor horses, I think if you were to compare a horse in the wild versus a competitive horse, it might be different. Maybe we're projecting our stressors onto our animals.
Oh, entirely. Absolutely. Yeah, it is. And the diet is so different.
Yeah.
We feed our athletic performance horses so differently than we do, natural wild horses. So yeah, I wanted to interject that. It was interesting.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a really good point. And I think a really good example of how as humans maybe sometimes we're not the smartest of the species. I'm just looking through the chat here. Increased alcohol intake, headaches, poor immune system, depletion of the immune system, motivation issues for sure. There's a litany of these. For me, being in this area of study, or, you know, being familiar with this, I'm highly aware of how my stress manifests itself. So if I have long chronic stress, so something that's going to, you know, last a couple weeks, my appetite goes up. If I have very acute stress, can't eat, which causes other problems as well. So if I have a big stressful day, I can't eat that day. But if it's something that's prolonged, if, you know, if I'm having a stressful couple of weeks and stuff, I have no problem eating. I get lots of muscle tension in my back. I know during my PhD, I had lots of back and neck issues that are starting to manifest themselves again now, shockingly, not so shockingly. I get stress headaches. So stress headaches are usually in the back of your head, sometimes coming to the front of your forehead, which isn't great when you're looking at COVID types of symptoms and needing to get tested. Do you have headaches? Yes, I do, but I'm pretty sure they're stress related. So yeah, different things that can manifest itself, and, you know, long term, they can create more serious chronic types of issues as well. So things to keep in mind. So thank you for those of you who contributed. That's helpful. I do want to kind of describe the different ways that stress manifests itself, or the different sources of stress. And stress happens in different ways. I wanted to talk about physical stress because I think it's not the first thing that comes to mind when we think of stress. And I'll come to kind of the psychological stress in just a moment. But considering the sport context, I wanted to really emphasize the importance of actual physical stress and the importance of thinking about it in parallel with psychological stress. Many of us use exercise as a way of coping with stress. It actually is a good, productive way to cope with stress, but like many things, to a certain extent. So don't let the endorphins fool you all the time. Exercise or physical activity, particularly in extreme cases, or when we really kind of overdo it, is a stress. So if you think that the goal of exercise, or the goal of training, or the goal of physical activity is to stress the body purposefully in a controlled way, and then in the end, the body responds by becoming stronger in preparation for the next time. So, you know, you might have heard this before, like, you don't actually gain muscle in the gym, you gain it when you rest, right? You push your muscles and your cardiovascular system in the gym, but then it's the recovery process that actually helps build the muscle. I want you to think that in parallel with the mental part. But if you were to go to the gym all the time and overtrain, that level of chronic stress on your body is not healthy. So it's important to not overtrain. You end up hurting yourself in the long run. And we actually have data to support, or research to support that, for example, like marathon runners tend to get sick following a race. Because they've been stressed, or their body has been stressed to the point where where their immune system is compromised. Okay. Please. I'm happy, Steve, to support that statement. So in the same realm, if you think of stress mentally, it's also important to not overtrain or overexert yourself. And it's also important for recovery, right? So going into mental or emotional stress, or we sometimes call it cognitive stress, so cognitive being part of the brain. I'm so stressed, I feel overwhelmed, there's just not enough time in the day. Those are probably things that sound familiar. And mental emotional stress can be caused by things, you know, you encounter every day: work stress, family, interpersonal relationships, whether they're family, coworkers, or whatnot, finance, future. As I'm listing these, you might feel your blood pressure increasing by the second. But, you know, all of these things, again, it's perception, can be different stressors to different people, and many people perceive it differently. In one of my classes, a class that I do teach, it's basically just about stress and it impacts the system. I get my students the beginning of the year, the semester, to write down their top 3 stressors anonymously. We just kind of put it in a hat. We start pulling out lists, and it really makes a good example of how people react differently to stress or perceive it differently. Okay, so I did want to make sure we differentiated between stress and anxiety. And I think this is really important because cognitive stress, or stress in our brain, can manifest itself into feelings of anxiety. And I use these terms very carefully because the word anxiety is probably one of the most overused or most inappropriately used term, second to the word depression. And we have a tendency to kind of use these words without necessarily understanding the underlying implications of using these words. And all of this is coming from kind of the more openness of talking about mental health and mental health challenges and whatnot, which is a fantastic thing. We should be talking about these. But we're getting to a point where we're starting to misuse these terms. So I want to be clear in terms of what I mean when I talk about anxiety. Anxiety, for the context and the purpose of this discussion, is a negative emotional state with feelings of worry, nervousness, apprehension associated with activation or arousal in the body. So there's a physiological response that is in partner with worry, being nervous, or apprehension. Okay. What's important to note is that being anxious is normal. Feelings of anxiety. I often use the term feelings of anxiety as opposed to the word anxiety, because feeling anxious or being anxious is normal. It's okay. So when you're encountering an anxious situation, having feelings of anxiety is a normal reaction. We're built that way. Having anxiety or feelings of anxiety does not equate to having an anxiety disorder or clinical anxiety or suffering from anxiety. So it's important to kind of understand kind of where that line is. So when we talk about anxiety disorders or clinical anxiety, that would be diagnosed by a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist. When we talk about that level, it means that it's severely impacting your day-to-day life, meaning you can't leave the house, meaning you can't function, quote unquote, normally. When, if you're going to a big game and you're anxious, that's normal. If you're going to write an exam and you feel anxious, also normal, expected. And honestly, I don't like using the word normal. Expected or typical might be better suited. So important in terms of, for the purpose of this discussion, feelings of anxiety is something that we should expect in anxious situations. We differentiate between trait and state anxiety. So state anxiety being, are you generally an anxious person? So you might, have feelings of anxiety more often than not. Trait anxiety, state anxiety, I think I mixed those up. Trait anxiety is more generally all the time, kind of low levels, but you're generally kind of feelings of anxiousness. State anxiety is being anxious in one moment in that particular state. And those, while they're related, they can be different as well. So knowing this, what purpose do stress and anxiety serve? If we have evolved as a species to have feelings of stress and anxiety, they must serve a purpose, right? So it's not like a belly button where, we've evolved to have a belly button, but what purpose does that serve after we've, been birthed? Doesn't really serve a purpose. But everything else has a purpose to serve. So thinking about what it would be, essentially, stress and anxiety serves to protect us. It's about survival. It's about increasing our survival. And as humans and as other animals, all our instincts are meant to help our survival. So no different for us. But what about in sport? Okay, So when we think about a day-to-day in sport, depending on the sport, the massive threat is not really all that high. So what purpose would you think that stress and anxiety would serve in sport or in your coaching, honestly? Any thoughts on that? Ensuring safety, yeah. Protecting yourself. Makes you more aware, yeah. Focusing skills, for sure. So the more stress we have, the more narrow our focus becomes. So I like to think, you know, the kid in the outfield who's chasing butterflies, not really stressed. And they pay attention and they're distracted by everything, right? So their focus is pretty wide and broad. A person who is stressed tend to get tunnel vision, right? You don't pay attention to a lot of things, which in some instances can be really helpful, in others not so much, right? Provides a sense of urgency, yeah. So there's some kind of pressure. So stress can provide some positive and negative pressure to want to perform, absolutely. Okay, I mean, just for the sake of time here, when we talk about feelings and emotions, which stress and anxiety kind of are related to, their purpose of feelings and emotions and etc. are meant to communicate with us. So when I'm sad, it's telling me something. When I'm happy, I'm being communicated with, right? So if stress and anxiety are also meant to communicate with us, are we listening? What does stress and anxiety in coaching, what is it communicating to you? Any thoughts on that? If you are stressed as a coach, what is that communicating to you? Any thoughts? Increased risk, yep. That you can be projecting your stress to your athletes or your horse or animals, yep. So thinking back to the definition of stress, the perception of the demands versus your resources. Okay. If you're stressed, it means that you have more demands and not enough resources. So thinking in that front, that we should chill like a cat and recharge, absolutely. Maybe we should, there's only two ways to kind of balance that equation, right? Either we decrease our demands or we increase our resources to balance that scale out. So if we're stressed, there's an imbalance. If we want to reduce stress, we need to manage that balance by either decreasing demands or increasing our resources, right? I'll come back to this. Are you listening? And I laughed to myself as I was typing this out earlier this week. I am very, very poorly skilled at listening to my own stress communicating to me. I joke, I say some people need a nudge, some people need a push, some people need a brick wall. I'm the person that needs a brick wall. Usually, I run myself ragged to the point where I'm like, oh, okay, now I really should relax, which is counterintuitive considering what I teach and preach every day, right? So we're not good at listening, even though we know that we should be listening. It's like exercise. Everybody knows that we should be doing it. Everybody pretty much knows that it's good for you, but there's still only about 25% of the entire population that do it. So knowing doesn't always mean behaving in a certain way, okay? So thinking about whether you are listening to yourself in terms of what your stress and your anxiety is communicating to you. So examples in coaching. So I kind of went over this as already, but in coaching particularly, if anybody has any other examples, please unmute and put her in the chat. But I also want to think about this last question here. Considering what we've already discussed, what do you think the outcome of stress will be for you, for your athletes, for your coaching ability? So if you run yourself ragged to the point where you're not listening to your own body and you're not listening to your stress and what it's communicating to you, how is it going to impact your performance as a coach? And we have this perception sometimes like, I need to keep going, because if I don't, I'm going to fail. When in reality, if you don't stop and recover, that might be what leads you to quote unquote fail, right? So sometimes the recovery, if we thinking again in parallel with the physical stress, if you overtrain in the gym and don't rest and recover, you're going to get injured. I think that's a fair statement to say. The same thing is going to happen if you don't recover from the mental aspect of stress as well, okay? So a couple things to think about. What can we do? So you're telling me I should recharge or prioritize rest and recovery. I want you to think about these two steps. The first step, absolutely, that we need to do as a society, and I'm asking big things here from a societal point of view. But step one, we need to stop normalizing burnout. We are in a society that glamorizes being busy. We seem to gloat about how busy we are. And when somebody tells us they're busy, we want to one-up them and tell them how much more busy I am, right? Oh, you're busy? Yeah, well, I do this and this and this. And it's like, who can be the busiest? And whoever is the busiest must be the most successful. That is such a load of BS. And we need to shift that narrative. And we also start feeling guilty if we're not busy. Right? Okay, well, if that person is doing all these things for me to be successful, I must be doing more. Which again, is sometimes efficiency in time is better with expectation, right? So step one, stop normalizing burnout. Okay. Yeah, burnout puts the blame on the worker, not the expectations of the employer. I think as employers too, we need to reconsider. I was lucky enough to spend some time in Europe, and I think they have, in some places in Europe, have this idea of, being busy and is not necessarily a good thing. Rest is really important. But step two is we need to start normalizing recovery. We need to start thinking about, no, it's okay to rest. I'm actually going to be better off and more productive if I rest. So if organizations are really listening or in tune to what's happening, they will be okay with people resting because they know it's better off for their employers to be resting. Otherwise, you're just going to get increased turnover and poor productivity and poor performance, okay? We need to do the same emotionally as we do most of the time physically. So what can you do? I want to remind you again here of the reality is stress, arousal, anxiety, they're inevitable. We can't eliminate it all. They're going to happen. However, they are manageable and they are controllable. Thinking about that equation again, you either decrease demands or you increase resources. Okay, so some tips on, this seems pretty simplistic, but how do we help? You have to identify sources of stress. Can you control them or not? Okay. If it's not something you can control, all right, what can I do to increase my resources? If I can't control the demands, can I control my resources? And resources can be energy. I can control my energy by resting. It can be time management. I don't like the term time management because there's only a finite amount of time, but energy is a little bit more malleable. You can develop coping skills like breathing, resting, mindfulness. And mindfulness meditation gets kind of thrown around a lot. I'm not talking about sitting in quiet and doing deep breathing exercises. I mean, like active mindfulness practices. Go for a walk without your phone and just look around. Go in nature. Spend time with people that you enjoy their company. Prioritize mental rest and recovery, making that a priority. Okay. So again, looking at the stress process, we can intervene at any one of these stages. We can change the demand sometimes. You can also change how you perceive a demand, right? Oh, it's really stressing me out, or it's an opportunity, right? How you perceive the threat can have a big influence on your stress response. If you perceive the threat as an opportunity, you're doing whatever you can, and you still have a more negative stress response, that's when you can start doing breathing techniques, going for a walk, disengaging, engaging in rest and recovery. And then behavioral outcomes, that's kind of that's of course the outcome. So kind of intervening at this spot here takes a little bit more focus on your stress response. So things to keep in mind. I'm just cognizant of time here, but we are on the last slide. And I was thinking about how, some examples of self-care, and I've mentioned a couple. It's important to understand that there's productive strategies and unproductive strategies, okay? The example that I use a lot is when I was in grad school, an unproductive strategy I had was shopping. Retail therapy was one of my primary ways of managing stress. As a grad student who's struggling financially, that is not a productive strategy whatsoever. But it would create like a very short-term stress release. And then I would stress more about my finances as the days and weeks went on. So some strategies are not productive, okay? Some strategies are productive. So as you're thinking about how you're going to manage, for one of the most popular might be to crack open a bottle of wine and drink. Can be productive very short term, long term, does not always, but can lead to some very unproductive outcomes, okay? I also want you to think, I always ask this question because as coaches, myself included, we usually put our athletes first and think about how we can help them. So if you had an athlete coming to you with, I'm stressed and whatnot, what advice would you give your own athletes? And I think for the majority of skillful and really good coaches, if you're recognizing that your athletes are tired and stressed and overtrained, you might say something like, hey, maybe you should get some rest. Maybe you should, take it easy for a week or two and then kind of recover. We need to start taking our own advice, myself included. And everybody's going to be a little bit different. So I can list some examples of self-care, but I think, in the context of this group, if you're engaging in mentorship for the mentors, it's important to be honest and share your own strategies and your own struggles with managing stress and feelings of anxiety. We need to normalize it. We need to make it okay to talk about it and make it okay to recover and rest. And again, stop normalizing this idea of being busy and burnt out is the goal, because it's not. You're actually not being less productive. Yeah. So yeah, hug. I would put an asterisk to that in a pandemic, making sure that you're engaging in productive activities, spending time with people who energize you as opposed to suck the energy out of you. If you're going to engage in exercise, making sure that you're not overdoing it, because as we've mentioned, it can also be a source of stress. Okay. that's what I have for slides. I'm happy to answer any questions. I know I got some questions ahead of time. I tried to kind of integrate the answers into my presentations, but if I didn't necessarily answer your questions, please feel free to answer or ask the questions again. But essentially you want to engage in activities and behaviors that are also going to help you recover and manage your stress. So I'll open up for questions if anybody has any thoughts or points or suggestions as well.
Great, thank you so much, Lori. I had a couple light bulb moments, so thank you very much. Even like the sciencey part at the beginning, that's when I was like, oh yeah, I can relax. Like I was supposed to relax. So yeah, this was great. I'm sure a lot of coaches can relate with that. Yes, so I have recorded the session, Jolene, so it will be on YouTube and I'll be sending it just to VIP and mentorship coaches, so you'll be able to access it. But does anyone have any questions for Lori? Feel free to unmute or put it in the chat box.
As I said in the intro, I hope that this didn't stress you out more.
I know it didn't stress me out, so thank you, Lori. I don't think there's any questions, but
Lori, I have one.
Sure, Steve. Hi, Steve.
Just a little bit more on trait versus state.
Yeah.
So I do have trait anxiety, which is, fun every day of my life. And I also, of course, as a coach and a, formerly recovering athlete, maybe I'm not formerly, I am seeing, at least in my coaching practice, more state anxiety kids. I've got about 4 or 5 now that are seeing therapists that are on medication. And sometimes I wonder if it's like puffers 20 years plus, which is what it was 20 years ago. It was everybody had asthma and they were now on puffers. Well, now everyone's seeing a therapist, which again, they have their place. And I'm wondering, you said you spent some time in Europe and that some things they do really well, and moving away from the phone would be lovely. And we do that at practice. Like I have all the kids are giving me their phones at the beginning of practice. It's great. So they are focused. I guess my wonderment is, are you seeing in your academic world and your work with the Canadian Sports Centre and the national teams, are you seeing more athletes in your practice with trait as well as state?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And if I'll go back to here. Okay, so if you think of the goal of exercise, stressing the body to a certain, incrementally with the purpose of kind of gaining strength, right? If we use the same analogy with the mental aspect of stress, so we're stressing ourselves mentally incrementally in short bursts and whatnot, then we build the skills to be able to manage that anxiety and that stress. And then we kind of build this idea of resilience or being able to cope with stress and whatnot. I see this not happening on the mental side. We have, as a society, as an education system, as a parenting trend, have tried to remove every stress possible from our growing children and adolescents. And then all of a sudden when stress happens, they can't manage, right? So it would be the equivalent of having somebody who's never done any physical activity whatsoever and throwing them in the gym and having to do like 5 rep max squats. They're not going to deal well with that, and they're likely going to be injured because there's been no preparation no incremental kind of preparation for that. So this whole removing stressors from a societal point of view, and we as coaches can't solve that problem in a day, but I am seeing it more in my university students, because things like something as simple as you're losing 10% of your mark for handing in your assignment late is causing severe stress, because our school system, for example, has buffered that, has created a system where that's okay. So they can't handle that kind of stress. And I realize it's a systemic thing. We have as a society kind of built this, we're taking all the stress away from all of our growing children. And that's not 100% bad, but if we could just kind of teach our kids, provide a little bit of stress and teach them how to manage that, you would likely see better coping skills. And I think that's what we're missing. So I know that's a huge can of worms. But personally, that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a lot less ability to manage stress. And I think it also comes with this idea of like, oh my God, I'm having feelings of anxiety, therefore I must, have an anxiety disorder. So we're not normalizing or being okay with negative emotions. And that's also a problem. I think we're so, as a society, we're so afraid of negative emotions and negative stress that when they happen, and they will happen, that we're not prepared to manage them. Yeah. Again, a big can of worms, but I think if I can summarize that as much as possible, that's how I would do that. I'm getting a couple questions just directly here. In terms of this idea of the comments on it's all right to not feel all right, I think something that I like that statement within a certain kind of boundary. It is okay to not feel okay. That's normal. Absolutely. The same idea as I just said, like we need to be okay to sit in our negative feelings and recognize them and understand them and reflect on what it's communicating with us. But like everything, I think the pendulum has kind of swung far, and we're not necessarily interpreting that statement at its best, at its most optimal way. So I do think that it's absolutely okay to not feel okay. But we also need to do something with it. We need to recognize it. Why are you not feeling okay? What can you do about not feeling okay? What is that communicating to us? So it's such a gray area, and I'm careful in how I'm communicating this, because there's a difference between mental illness and mental health in that sense. And sometimes that line can get blurred because we're not comfortable with that negative state or those negative emotions or feelings. I'm just looking at some other questions. What are some common successful strategies that you recommend and have seen to be successful? Taking time, literally stepping away, whether it's for 5 minutes or for 5 hours or 5 days. Taking the time, going for a walk. I know it sounds so simple, but that's what makes it complicated, because it is so simple that we think that it's too simple. When in fact, going out for a walk for 20 minutes can do a world of good. And when I say go out for a walk, I mean like actually go for a walk and not take your phone and check your email while you're walking. It's going out in nature and looking up and recognizing. It's doing things that make you laugh. Controlled breathing exercises is one of the strategy, and I say like actually doing the exercises properly is one of the most effective ways of getting your body from a sympathetic state to a parasympathetic state. And that is basic belly breathing at a ratio of 10 seconds per breath, inhaling or exhaling slightly longer than your inhale. It's that simple. And when you've practiced those breathing exercises, you can typically, a trained person, and I'm talking like somebody that practices their breathing, can have their body go from a sympathetic state to a parasympathetic state in about 3 to 4 breaths. And we think that, oh, breathing is easy. It's not. I've worked with athletes on years on how to breathe properly. Again, it's because it seems so simple, we don't tend to think we have to practice it. So, but because it has such an profound impact, you actually do need to purposefully practice. Yeah, physical body checking before starting, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, any other questions?
All right, I think that's it. Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you everyone for your questions and for coming on here tonight. Lori, we really appreciate this. Like, I think this is applicable to coaches in any season, but definitely this one. So yeah. Thank you so much. Really valuable, and we'll definitely be sharing this online with our VIP and mentorship coaches.
Great.
So thank you.
Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your night, and keep breathing, everybody.
Thanks, Lori.
Bye-bye.
Guys, stay safe.